Hi, I'm Beck and welcome to my February wrap up. I read 5 books in February, but then I also DNF'd, so did not finish or put down 2 books. So I'm going to talk about all of them. The first book that I want to talk about is Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. And even though I do obviously physically own it, I listened to this on audiobook and I kind of agree with what everyone else has been saying about this. So before I jump into my thoughts, the first book, Black Sun, follows a group of characters and they're all at different points in the story. So the main ones are Naranpa, Serapio, and Shiala. Shiala is a ship captain. She has to transport this cargo. Serapio is in the throes of this magical, almost cult that is linked up with their religion, and he happens to have some kind of tie to the sea captain. And then Naranpa is in the city that they are going to on this sea voyage. And in the city, there is a massive outcry and rebellion happening currently as well. So there's a lot going on here with the world building and the magic, and that really comes to a head obviously in the conclusion of Black Sun, and then a few threads are picked up and continued in here. And this to me felt the same way that a lot of other people were describing it as, which is very second book syndrome. And by that I mean this is just a setting up book. It's moving the characters around on the chessboard to where they need to be for book 3. And when characters are together, for me, is when I get the most enjoyment out of them. And if you split them away from the initial setup that you made emotional for them, it takes my care factor away because I now don't care about the emotional stakes of the story. And that's very much, in a very non-spoiler vague sense, what happened here. It felt very just led by the plot a lot. And some of the choices in here I just didn't care about. And the tensions, like politically, I didn't care about very much either. I thought about this a lot and I'm going to give it 3 stars because 3 stars is middle of the road for me, and that's very much what this was. When I give a 2-star rating, usually I actively dislike several different things about it, but there might be 1 or 2 saving graces about it. I didn't actively dislike this book. I did enjoy bits of the ending. I didn't love the whole ending, but there were pieces there. So I think those embers of what I liked in here definitely could be rekindled and further explored in the 3rd book, but I don't really love what happened in here. So it's only a 3, but ultimately I continued a series, which was one of my goals for the year overall. And I think the next book comes out in August, and that's the 3rd one. So at least I'm up to date now for the release in August, which I'm very happy with, but unfortunately, it was only a 3 stars and I was hoping it would be a 4 or 5. The first book for me was about 4.5 and I really loved it. Those first 10 pages were so like they went for your jugular. They were amazing. And I got none of that fire in here, which was quite disappointing. And then because it's February, which means obviously it's summer in Australia, I read Unnecessary Drama. I picked up a couple of contemporaries this month. And this one follows Jessie and Brooke. Brooke is moving from her small town into Melbourne to study, and she's living in a share house. She starts renting this share house and then realizes that there's going to be a 3rd housemate, and this housemate is Jessie, and she had a crush on him in high school. Things went awry because of various miscommunications and childhood reactions that you do as a teenager, and they shouldn't have as much emotional value as they do. It keeps you awake because it's a cringe memory. It's one of those kinds of scenarios. So something like that happened between them when they were teenagers, about 14, and now they're almost 20 and they've got to live together in this share house. And I liked that because of that forced proximity, it forced them to have conversations and kind of rekindle their friendship. So it's a friendship to enemies to friendship to lovers story. While I enjoyed this for the most part, I did give it a 4. I liked the tone and the humor of it. It was a really quick and easy read, and those are really my standards for contemporary books. I did like the discussion of mental health, and I feel like it could have been done a little bit deeper because some of the things about this main character was that she self-sabotaged a lot because of her anxiety. And as someone myself who suffers from anxiety, I can see those different patterns developing of where I'm starting to go into like a negative mental spiral. And because this character just let herself go with the negative mental spirals and just spiraled out of control in the sense that she wouldn't talk to anybody and wouldn't address almost internally what was happening and what she was self-justifying, it was very frustrating to read about because I can see that about myself, and surely she could be able to see that too. So it was just annoying that she stopped doing things and that made the plot develop further, when having a conversation would have actually benefited a lot more for her character. So it was just frustrating with the kinds of choices that her anxiety made the plot do or pursue. But aside from that, and my realization that I don't think I like super anxiety riddled main characters in contemporary books, just because sometimes it can get pushed way too far for the sake of the plot, I guess, tension. I'm glad I read it, and I did like her other book. It sounded better in my head more because it was more humorous. The only things that really just frustrated me were that internal dialogue of the main character, because they were just very constant and intense. But again, that does really represent anxiety very well. So, you know, it really probably depends on what kind of person you are and how subjectively you read this and how much you relate to Brooke as a main character. But I did enjoy it, so I guess that's a win. Then I started on ebook The Magic Between, because I thought this book was going to be a gay man and a bisexual main character get together and have this beautiful romance, and there is a little bit of magic in there in the sense that there are fated mates. And so I thought, oh, this guy doesn't know he's bisexual, he's going to run into this guy and get that ping of that fated mates thing and get confused, and it's going to be a great introspective way to explore character and queer identities in a story. It wasn't really like that. It could have been, and I think the concepts really overtook the story for me. I didn't love the writing style, I guess, because it felt like, oh, it's Harry Styles, like main character who is a famous dude, falls in love with this guy who he met once, and they are starting to kind of maybe date each other, but as friends, even though both of them felt that spark. So already it was denying what they'd both initially felt. And I don't love that whole like famous figure meeting someone who is mundane. I just didn't really enjoy it, and I ended up putting it down. My notes said that it was lacking in character voice. So I think that's why I also didn't connect to it, because I expected it to have so much character and so much flair. And then I ended up putting it down at 13% because it just wasn't vibing with me, which is really unfortunate, but at least I tried. Then I read another book called The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and you might recognize this book title because I started this last year and it accidentally returned early to my library, and so I put it down because it got returned, not because I wanted to stop reading it. So I ended up borrowing the audiobook from a friend, and that's how I finished it. So I'm really happy that that audiobook got me into the tone of the story. So we're following a bunch of housewives in Texas. So Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, they're Southern ladies. And because they're Southern ladies, they're all very polite and they respond to etiquette. But underneath the surface, they all used to be into their careers before they had to have children and stay home with them. The main character used to be a nurse. And so because they have all of this history and they're wanting something to kind of spice up their lives because they're sick of talking children all the time, they start this book club and they read true crime books and they read fiction as well. And they just get together and discuss like gruesome murder, which is really cool. And something in this town happens, and because these children keep going missing, they start to link it to this person who has appeared in their town and like kind of got roots in the town now and knows everybody now and has established themselves in this town. So because it is a literal vampire, like sucking the wealth out of the town and sucking away their reputation, it was a really great look at different themes around that and the way it developed its characters and the way that the time passed as well. It was very clever. Sometimes when I read books like this, it's like, oh, super duper happy la la ending. And I think this had the right amount of stakes and the right amount of fallout to balance everything out. So I gave it 4 stars. And I think it was a really brilliant read. It's not usually what I would naturally reach for. It really just stuck with me. And the kind of tension points in each act, 1, 2, and 3, it didn't really amp up for me until more like mid to late in the book. So if you're waiting for that like kick, it just starts to kind of lay the foundations and slowly bring you in, and then it kicks. So don't expect the kick straight away. I was expecting that hook. The prologue really hooked me in the way the author introduced the Southern ladies. That was really clever. So that piqued my interest, hooked me in, and then I could settle for the rest of the story being developed. So I think it was a really clever book, and I think it was really brilliantly performed as an audiobook as well. It really immerses you in the whole story, so I would recommend that as an audio. I think I said that I gave it 4 stars already, but I gave it 4 stars. Then I read another contemporary book, and that is The Charm Offensive. This follows Dev and Charlie, and Charlie is this new star of this reality TV show, but again, he's got anxiety and OCD, and he's only doing this as like a publicity stunt because he used to be this millionaire and he was part of this tech company, and this tech company let him go. And so because of that kind of breakdown in his career, he's like, I need to get my name out there, I need to start kind of fresh. And so that's what he's trying to do, and that's what his publicist is pushing. And while he's trying to do that, when he gets onto this reality TV show, which is kind of like The Bachelor, he finds out that Dev is his handler. So Dev manages everything about Charlie's job on set and also off set as well. They kind of build this rapport with each other, so they understand each other better and can respond better on the day to the different film shoots and the different girls and their interactions during the scenes. Because Dev is falling for Charlie and Charlie actually might be falling for Dev as well, it was great to see them build trust with each other. But I should have known, like, because this has a reality TV show at the center of it, it is naturally going to be quite dramatic in the last section of the book. I was like, I hope they don't do the whole reality drama thing, but they did, and honestly, I don't know what I expected. I'm probably going to give this 3.5 stars because I really enjoyed the lead up to the ending, but I didn't really love the ending very much, and I could not suspend my disbelief enough. So I did like the characters, and I will give them a big tick. They were great, and I loved the tension in here as well, and the deep introspective way that Charlie had to reevaluate who he was and what he wanted. I think it was great to see them kind of unite together. But again, I didn't like the ending, so that's a bit disappointing. Like I said before, it is a contemporary, it's supposed to be kind of enjoyed and a bit fluffy, and it did have scenes that were a little bit fade to black, and that was a bit disappointing too, because when I read a romance, like, I want all of it, okay? In real life in general, I don't like reality TV. I actually hate watching it, and I feel like I can feel my brain cells dying as I'm watching it. It's just not for me. Like, I get that that's the point of the TV show in general, like, switch your brain off, invest in this show that you can narrate from your own comfort, but I don't like them. So I thought, oh, I'm really worried about whether I'll like this or not. And some parts clearly I did, but obviously not the whole thing. So at least I tried it, and I'm happy that I tried it because it was a male-male romance, and I'm all about queer romance. Then I was really lucky because a friend at work lent me Nick and Charlie, the novella following the characters from Heartstopper, and I just adore Nick and Charlie so much. They are my favorite little cinnamon rolls. They're just adorable. But in this book, they are 18 and 17. So Nick is going to eventually be moving shortly for university, and Charlie is staying behind because he's still got that year of school to get through. And so he's really worried about being abandoned. And so this whole thing comes up, like, are we going to be able to do long distance? Do we need to break up? And I just got very frustrated about the tension in this story. It felt like it was blown out of proportion a little bit because given the history of how Nick and Charlie communicate with each other and how they are quite obviously in tune with each other's emotions and are very tender with each other, which is something that I loved about Heartstopper so much, it didn't really translate as well to this novella, and maybe because it was written and I couldn't see literally their facial expressions and I had to imagine it all, but still, it felt like the tension again was a little bit too engineered, and they are 18 and 17. It's not like they're 14 and just having a massive blowout. Like, they can discuss things. So the degree of the tension frustrated me quite a lot, and I'd probably give this a 3 stars because, again, it was the middle of the road. I didn't love the tension so much, but I loved Nick and Charlie so much, so I had to kind of put the story in the middle of the rating system I've got, which is a 3. So I'm glad I read it and that I didn't buy it and that I could return it to my work friends so that I didn't spend any money on it. And then into the second book that I did not end up finishing, and that is A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. So what happens in this story is Maya, I think, is the main character. I can't remember. How bad is that? Anyway, she is a baker at her aunt's bakery. Her parents passed away a long time ago in some accident, and that's kind of the key trope for fantasy books, but this is supposed to be like a cozy fantasy. And for me, cozy fantasy is very low stakes, usually set in one or two locations. It usually involves a lot of character growth and just like wholesome interactions between characters. Sometimes there can be like a tension point for the story to progress and like reach a crescendo, but it's not usually anything that requires like massive response to action. But in this story, Maya is attending the bakery at 4 o'clock in the morning because she's getting all of the bread and everything ready for all the customers to come in later. And when she attends the bakery, she finds a girl on the floor that's been murdered. There's this whole investigation about it, and this woman was actually a magic user, and Maya is also a magic user, but her only magical talent is related to baking. Like, she can influence the bread and make it less hard and more fluffy and that kind of thing. She can animate gingerbread men to walk around and do a quick dance, and then they just go back to being normal gingerbread men again. So because she's got that speciality, obviously she's working in a bakery and she loves it. But now, because there's been a murder and there are potential magickas in this town that are threatened, she might be one of those magickas that are threatened. So it really spirals out further into this whole plot with this murdered woman has a younger brother, and he's kind of like a street rat, and Maya recognizes that he's in this situation and like leaves bread out for him, and they form like this kind of friendship, I suppose. And then the Duchess is linked in, and the royal politics are brought in, and the magicka that is a murderer is like a serial killer. And I was like, I don't actually care anymore. I was starting this book honestly because it was marketed as cozy fantasy, and it really started with cozy fantasy. Like, I was immediately immersed, but then like lingering almost maybe a quarter into the book, because I got about 50 or 60% in, that whole middle section I did not care about. It felt very flat to me, and I'd often forget that I was reading it. It was on an ebook for me, and so maybe if I had the physical book I'd be more reminded that I was reading something. But honestly, I was just reading this when I felt like I should be reading it, not because I felt like I was enjoying it. And that's when I decided to put it down, because if I'm not loving it, then there's no reason to waste my time on it. It was just not worth it to me, and that's really disappointing given the tone that it started on. That was a giant cockatoo. I don't know if you heard, it just screamed at the end of my sentence. Oh my god. Okay. Anyway, on that note, Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, DNF'd, and onto my last book for this wrap up. And that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a standalone fantasy book set in the 1800s, and it follows Robin, and he's a young Chinese boy taken from Canton by this professor, and this professor kind of trains him up in different languages and then sends him off to Oxford. And he's one of many children in this situation that are taken from their motherland and sent to Oxford to learn the arts of translation, so then they can be deployed by the British Empire, and that will be the way that the British Empire start to take over the world. And as you have guessed, this is a story that is very deeply rooted in colonialism through Robin's point of view, and it takes a while for that to recognize. I liked the beginning and the middle because it really leaned on these characters and kind of dark academia, because they're learning all these intricacies about language and how to apply that to this magic system that is very loosely based in the world around translation. So to know magic, you need to be able to speak fluently in different languages. So it's not like the different professors teaching these languages who are English can just imbue these silver bars with magical properties. They can't, because they're not fluent. So these different characters that are taken from their motherland are taken when they're just old enough to remember their mother tongue, and they're trained still in their mother tongue, but also in English, German, and Latin. And so because they're trained in all these different languages, naturally they are more fluent in them than, say, the professors will be. So the magic works for them. So they are deployed by the Empire in order to conquer further and further and further away from England. So because of these very heavy themes, and because of the way the story was written, let me just read you this one sentence. This is Robin describing the whole structure of colonialism and how characters like him, who are the minorities, are fighting against it. It says, the oppressive swathe of denigrating narrative they fought against. That is the scope of how the story is written. It felt like both reading an academic text that had fantasy squished into it. And don't get me wrong, like, I really enjoyed this book. I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but I really valued this book, and I gave it 4 stars. And based on my reading of this book compared to The Poppy War, which is a fantasy, like a full-on fantasy by the same author. I gave The Poppy War 2 stars and did not like the last half at all, but I really liked and respected this book, and it was really dark and in some parts gruesome, but very intentionally, and I think it made all its choices in a very deliberate and intense way, and that's the reason I liked it. I don't know if I'd necessarily need to own it, but it is one that I would recommend. But if you're not in that mood to absorb information, I think that give this a pass, because when I was listening to it on audiobook, it paused every now and then and kind of read you the footnotes, and I felt like those were very well amalgamated into the story. They didn't take me out of it at all. They really felt like quite well placed and like they belonged there. So it was a lot of information to absorb, and the audiobook did feel like it took me many years to finish. So it was a long one, it was dense, but it was worth it, and I'm glad that I read it. Even though my history with this author and loving her work has not been the greatest, I'm really happy that I tried Babel. So those are all the books that I read and put down and listened to in February. Let me know if you've read any of these or have similar or opposite thoughts. I would love to know. I can't wait to get into my March TBR, but thank you so much for watching this video. I'll come chat to you down below in the comments, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.